I'll
The morning
position
I
the
found the
truck right
listing,
here to start
I
leveling
thought
the
it had
bank
to
this
be a
morning.
mistake.
Looks
My
like an ideal
lakefront land,
spot.
the
Let's
same
get
piece of
started before
property
the
my
midday
father
heat.
handed me the keys to 18
Look at
years
section
ago
4.
was
This
being
data is
advertised
incorrect.
online like
That
it
can't
had
be
never
right.
belonged
We
to me at
verified
all.
those figures
New
yesterday.
photos, new price.
Let me see the backup.
New owner listed as the HOA. At first, I laughed. Because what else do you do when something feels that absurd? I figured it was a typo or some kind of clerical mix-up. Maybe someone uploaded the wrong parcel number. Maybe the HOA accidentally posted the neighboring lot. Mistakes happen. Then I saw the words, privately owned community lakefront parcel, sold by HOA due to unpaid assessments. My stomach dropped. Unpaid assessments. On land I owned free and clear. Land with no mortgage. No liens. No disputes. The same land where my dad taught me how to fish at sunrise, where my kids built their first crooked sandcastle, where my wife and I planned the cabin we never got around to building. That land. And according to the listing, it was already sold. That's when the pit in my stomach turned into something colder. Something heavier. Because this wasn't just a typo. There were closing photos. A sold banner. Congratulations to the new buyer. Someone had bought my property. I wish I could tell you I handled this calmly. That I made a few polite phone calls and everything got sorted out. But the truth is, the first call I made was to the HOA office, and it lasted less than 3 minutes. The woman on the phone sounded bored, like she'd answered this question 100 times before. Yes, the property was sold at auction last month due to delinquent HOA dues. I actually laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. I don't owe HOA dues. I told her, I've never owed HOA dues. That land isn't even part of your association. Silence. Then she said something that made my heart start pounding in my ears. Sir, according to our records, it is. That was the moment everything shifted. The moment this stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like something much bigger. Something legal. Something messy. Something that didn't make sense no matter how many times I replayed it in my head. Because here's the thing. I had the original deed. The real one. The document signed, stamped, and recorded long before the HOA even existed. And yet somehow, they had sold my lakefront land anyway. So I drove out to the property. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed proof that the world hadn't gone completely insane. When I turned down the gravel road and saw the new private property sign hammered into the ground, my chest tightened. But what I saw next made me slam on the brakes and just sit there in stunned silence. A man was standing on my land. He wasn't fishing or walking a dog or passing through. He was measuring. Long yellow tape stretched across the shoreline, staked into the ground like the future had already been decided. A truck sat parked near the trees, its bed stacked with lumber and concrete bags. Someone wasn't visiting. They were preparing to build. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. For a moment, I actually questioned my own memory. Maybe the HOA really did own this parcel. Maybe I'd misunderstood the boundaries all these years. Maybe grief had blurred things after my dad passed, and I'd missed something buried in paperwork. But deep down, I knew better. This land had been in our family long before the neighborhood existed. Before the gates. Before the manicured lawns and uniform mailboxes and rulebooks thick enough to double as doorstops. Back when my parents bought the property, the lake was quiet and wild. No clubhouse, no board meetings, no monthly duas. Just open water and a dirt road that turned to mud every spring. My dad used to joke that the only HOA back then was Mother Nature, and her rules were simple. Respect the land and it would respect you back. When the new development moved in years later, we got the letters. Invitations to join the association. Friendly at first, then persistent, then official-looking envelopes with bold lettering and return addresses from law offices. My dad kept every single one in shoebox. I'm not joining something I didn't ask for, he'd say. They can build their fences and make their rules. This land isn't part of it. After he passed, the shoebox came to me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table going through the envelopes, feeling overwhelmed by paperwork and grief and the sudden weight of being responsible for everything he'd left behind. Taxes, utilities, insurance, maintenance. It felt like adulthood hit all at once. But one thing I never questioned was the land. It was paid off, clean title, No mortgage. No liens. The county records confirmed it when I checked years later while planning that cabin we kept talking about. Everything looked exactly as it should. So how does land that isn't in an HOA suddenly owe HOA fees? I finally forced myself to step out of the car. Gravel crunched under my shoes as the man with the measuring tape noticed me approaching. He gave a polite wave, the kind neighbors give each other when everything is normal. "Morning," he called out. "Morning." Like we were just two people sharing the same shoreline by coincidence. I asked him what he was doing. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "Getting ready to break ground," he said with a smile. "We just closed last week. Been dreaming about a lake house for years." We just closed last week. The words echoed in my head like a siren. He wasn't a trespasser. He wasn't sneaking around. He believed, completely, that he owned this land. And the worst part, he looked excited, proud. The way someone looks when they finally achieve something big after years of saving and waiting. I didn't tell him he might be standing on property that wasn't actually his. I didn't tell him the HOA might have sold something they never had the right to sell. Because in that moment, the situation felt bigger than both of us. Messier, legal in a way that could crush two families at once. Instead, I nodded and said I hoped his build went smoothly. Then I walked back to my car, hands shaking harder than before. Because now the conflict wasn't theoretical anymore. There was a buyer, a closing date, construction plans, real money exchanged, real contract signed. This wasn't just an HOA mistake. This was a chain reaction. And somewhere in that chain, my name, the rightful owner, had vanished. That night, I opened a shoebox again, dug past the old letters and yellowing envelopes until I found the document wrapped in plastic at the very bottom. The original deed. Signed, stamped, recorded. Proof that this land was ours long before the HOA existed. I held it in my hands for a long time, realizing something that made the situation even more unsettling. If I had the original deed, then what exactly had the HOA used to sell my property? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw a survey tape stretched across the shoreline and a stranger smiling about his dream house. The worst part wasn't even the anger. It was the creeping realization that this situation didn't have a clean villain. If the HOA had really sold the land, then someone had paid for it. Someone had signed papers, taken out a loan, maybe moved money they'd spent years saving, which meant that whatever came next was going to hurt more than one person. At sunrise, I was already at the county records office, the original deed sitting in a folder on the passenger seat like a fragile piece of evidence. The building smelled like old paper and printer ink, the same smell I remembered from years ago when I checked the title before planning the cabin. Back then, it had been routine, quick, boring even. This time, the clerk took longer. Her typing slowed, then stopped. She leaned closer to her screen, squinting like the words might rearrange themselves if she stared hard enough. "Sir," she said carefully, "there's a lien recorded on this parcel from the Homeowners Association." My chest tightened. "That's not possible." She turned the monitor toward me. A document appeared on the screen with the HOA's name stamped across the top. Official. Recorded. Real. According to the filing, the land had accumulated years of unpaid HOA dues, late fees, legal costs, and interest. Eventually, the lien turned into foreclosure, then an auction, then a sale, all done legally, all documented, all signed. It looked airtight, except for one detail. The address listed under the property owner's mailing information wasn't mine. It was my dad's old house, the one we sold years ago after he passed. Every notice, every warning letter, every legal filing had been sent to a place I no longer lived. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, heavy exhale. A technicality, a tiny administrative detail that suddenly didn't feel tiny at all. The clerk gave me a sympathetic look, the kind you give someone who just realized the ground under them isn't as solid as they thought. "If notices are mailed to the last known address on record," she said gently, "the process can move forward even if the owner never receives them." Even if the owner never receives them. The phrase echoed in my head the entire drive home. Because now the story had changed. This wasn't just an HOA acting recklessly. This was a system moving forward step by step, box by box, signature by signature. A process that didn't stop to ask whether the right person was actually being informed. And somewhere along the way, I had failed to update the mailing address after my dad died. I had assumed the county records would connect the dots, that transferring everything into my name meant the system understood where I lived now. I had assumed wrong. That realization sat heavy in my chest. Not guilt exactly, but something close. A quiet voice asking if this could have been prevented. If a single form filed years ago might have stopped everything before it started. It didn't excuse the HOA. It didn't make the sale feel right. But it cracked the story open just enough to make things complicated. And complicated stories don't have easy endings. When I got home, my wife was waiting at the kitchen table. I hadn't told her everything yet, just enough to explain why I'd rushed out at dawn with a folder clutched like a lifeline. She listened quietly as I explained the lien, the foreclosure, the auction. Her expression didn't shift until I mentioned the wrong address. "That house we sold?" she asked softly. I nodded. So all the warnings went there. I nodded again. She didn't say I should have updated it. She didn't say this could have been avoided. But the silence carried the weight of both thoughts anyway. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding since yesterday. What happens to the man building the house? The image of him measuring the shoreline flashed in my mind. The excitement in his voice. The pride. I don't know, I admitted, because fighting for my land meant potentially taking his away. And that's when the real moral knot tightened. This wasn't just me versus the HOA anymore. There was a third life tangled in the middle. That afternoon, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, almost let it go to voicemail. But something in my gut told me to answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself as the buyer. He said he got my number from the HOA. And then he asked a question that made my heart start racing all over again. Is it true you're claiming the land I just bought is yours? I stepped outside to take the call. The air felt thinner than it should have, like the world had quietly shifted while I wasn't looking. I walked to the edge of the driveway, phone pressed tight to my ear, staring at nothing. Yeah, I said finally. It's true. Silence filled the line. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind. He exhaled slowly. The HOA told me you might reach out. They said this was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. There was something fragile in his voice. Something cautious, like he was already bracing for impact. I'm not trying to fight you, he added quickly. I just want to understand what's happening. That sentence landed harder than anything else so far. Because he wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He sounded scared. We talked for nearly an hour. His name was Daniel. He'd been looking for lakefront property for 3 years. Saved aggressively. Sold a small rental property. Moved money from investments. This purchase wasn't casual. It was the plan. The big one. The closing had been smooth. Title company approved everything. Bank approved the loan. Insurance approved the coverage. Every professional involved had given him the same green light. You're telling me none of this should have happened? He asked quietly. I'm telling you I never sold it, I said. And I never got a single notice that the HOA thought they could. Another long pause. This is my worst nightmare, he whispered. Mine too, I thought, because suddenly the shape of the problem became terrifyingly clear. If the HOA was wrong, Daniel could lose the land. If the sale somehow stood, I could lose it. Either way, someone's life savings sat in the middle like a glass sculpture about to shatter. When the call ended, the quiet felt louder than before. 3 hours later, an email arrived from the HOA. Subject line, request for meeting, urgent property, dispute no greeting. No apology. Just a date, a time, and a conference room address. They wanted to meet the next morning. Sleep didn't come easy again that night. My mind kept replaying every version of the meeting before it even happened. Calm conversation. Heated argument. Legal threats. Blank stares. By sunrise, my stomach was in knots. The HOA office looked exactly how you'd expect. Neat landscaping, polished glass doors, the kind of building designed to feel official without feeling intimidating. The kind of place where problems are handled politely, professionally, and permanently. Inside the conference room sat 3 people. The HOA president, the property manager, and a lawyer. Seeing the lawyer changed the temperature instantly. No small talk. No coffee offered. Just a folder placed in the center of the table like a line drawn in the sand. The attorney slid it toward me. We understand you have concerns about the foreclosure and sale of Parcel 47B. Concerns. I placed my own folder on the table. Slower. Deliberate. My hands were steady now. I have the original deed, I said. The room went still. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just a quiet shift. Like air pressure dropping before a storm. The lawyer nodded. Unfazed. We expected that. Expected that. He opened his folder and began laying out documents one by one. Lienfiling. Certified mail receipts. Legal notices. Auction records. Closing paperwork. A paper trail stretching back years. Every step of the foreclosure process was followed according to state law, he said calmly. Notice was sent. Deadlines were met. The auction was conducted legally. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I slid the deed across the table. Signed. Stamped. Recorded. Proof older than their association. The HOA president leaned forward, studying it closely. The property manager shifted in her chair. The lawyer's calm expression tightened, just slightly. For the first time, the room felt uncertain. This property, I said carefully, was never part of the HOA. Silence. The kind that stretches long enough to feel physical. The lawyer tapped a finger against one of his documents. According to the subdivision expansion filed in 2008, it was annexed into the association. Annexed. A word that sounded small. Administrative. Harmless. Until you realized what it meant. They were claiming the land had been pulled into the HOA without my knowledge. Without my signature. Without my consent. My pulse roared in my ears. You can't just add someone's land to an HOA. Another pause. Another look exchanged between the three of them. Then the property manager spoke for the first time, voice hesitant. There may have been a mapping error when the expansion was recorded. The lawyer shot her a quick glance. Too quick. A crack in the story. Tiny, but real. My heart pounded harder. A mapping error big enough to foreclose and sell land that wasn't yours. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched. Thick. Uncomfortable. Dangerous. Finally, the lawyer closed his folder slowly and folded his hands. There may be, he said carefully, a path toward resolution. And the way he said it made one thing painfully clear. Whatever came next was going to change everything. The lawyer didn't explain the path toward resolution right away. Instead, he asked for a short break. 10 minutes, he said. Just enough time for them to review something internally. They stepped out of the conference room together, closing the glass door behind them. I sat alone at the table, staring at two folders that now felt heavier than bricks. Through the glass, I could see them whispering in the hallway. Quick sentences, tight expressions, the kind of conversation people don't want overheard. Something had shifted. When they came back, the energy in the room felt completely different, less confident, less rehearsed. The lawyer sat down slowly, folded his hands, took a breath like someone about to step onto thin ice. There's another complication, he said. My stomach dropped. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me. Not a legal document this time. An email printout, sent 6 months ago, from the HOA property manager to the HOA board. Subject line, Parcel 47B boundary concern. My eyes moved across the page, heart pounding harder with every sentence. The email explained that during routine map updates, someone noticed Parcel 47B didn't appear in the original HOA boundary filing. The wording was cautious, careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. They knew there might be a mistake. 6 months ago, I looked up slowly. You knew. The property manager's face had gone pale. We weren't certain. The lawyer stepped in quickly. It was an internal question that required legal interpretation, but you foreclosed anyway, I said. No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't sound terrible. And suddenly the story wasn't about a mapping error anymore. It was about a warning that had been quietly filed away while the process kept moving forward. My hands felt cold. Daniel's face flashed to my mind. Measuring tape. Lake house dreams. Life savings. 6 months. 6 months where someone could have stopped this before it reached an auction. Before contracts were signed. before money changed hands, before two families got pulled into the same storm. The lawyer cleared his throat. Once a foreclosure process begins, halting it can introduce liability. Liability. The word landed like a stone. They hadn't stopped because stopping would have been messy, expensive, embarrassing. So the machine kept moving. I pushed the email back across the table. Does the buyer know about this? Silence. My chest tightened. Does Daniel know you had doubts before the sale? The property manager looked down at the table. That was my answer. And suddenly the moral weight shifted again. Harder this time. Sharper. Because now the buyer wasn't just caught in the middle of a mistake. He had been kept in the dark. The lawyer spoke carefully. We are now exploring options to resolve the matter in a way that minimizes harm to all parties. Minimizes harm. Like this was a spreadsheet problem. What does that mean? I asked. He hesitated. And that hesitation told me everything before he even spoke. One possible solution, he said, is a financial settlement. The room went very, very quiet. My pulse pounded in my ears as the meaning sank in. They weren't talking about giving the land back. They were talking about buying me out, turning the lakefront property my father left me into a number on a check. My throat tightened. You want me to sell it to you? To the buyer, he corrected gently. Through mediated agreement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. Because this was the twist I hadn't prepared for. A fight over ownership was one thing, but a choice. A choice was worse. If I refused, Daniel could lose everything. His loan, his plans, his dream. If I agreed, my family's land, the place tied to my dad, my kids, every memory etched into that shoreline, would be gone forever. Two futures, one decision. And suddenly I understood why they'd used the word resolution so carefully. They weren't trying to decide who was right. They were trying to decide who would hurt less. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Daniel. How did the meeting go? I stared at the screen, the weight of the decision pressing down harder with every passing second. Because whatever I said next would start the clock on the ending of this story. I stared at Daniel's message for a long time before typing back. We need to talk in person. We met at the lake that evening. The sun was dipping low, turning the water gold the way it always did this time of day. It should have been peaceful, familiar. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a courtroom with no walls. Daniel was already there when I arrived, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, staring out across the shoreline. The survey tape still fluttered in the breeze. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I told him everything. The mapping error, the foreclosure, the email the HOA had sent 6 months before the auction, the settlement offer. I watched his expression change piece by piece, confusion, disbelief, frustration, and finally a quiet kind of heartbreak. They knew. He asked softly. I nodded. He laughed under his breath, but there was no humor in it. I hired a title company, a bank, lawyers, inspections, appraisals, every step they tell you to take to protect yourself. He kicked a small rock toward the water, and it still wasn't enough. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees behind us. I don't want to take your land, he said after a long silence. I swear I didn't know. I believe you, I replied. That was the problem. I did believe him. We stood there watching the sun sink lower, both of us understanding that the decision sitting between us didn't have a happy version, only a less painful one. Finally, he turned to me. What are you going to do? The truth was, I'd spent the entire day asking myself the same question, turning it over from every angle, thinking about my dad, my kids, the shoebox of letters, the email the HOA hoped no one would ever see, and the answer I landed on surprised even me. I'm not selling, I said quietly. He nodded once, slowly, like he'd expected it, like he'd been bracing for it. But before the silence could settle, I added, that doesn't mean you lose everything. He frowned. I don't understand. I took a breath. I want the land back. That part isn't negotiable. But the HOA caused this. Not you, and not me. They're the ones who have to make this right. The next few weeks became a blur of phone calls, documents, and meetings. Lawyers got louder. Emails got longer. The quiet politeness the HOA started with disappeared quickly once responsibility became unavoidable. Because the email changed everything. It proved they knew there was a serious boundary issue before the auction. It proved they chose not to stop the process. And that shifted liability in a way they couldn't ignore anymore. In the end, the HOA agreed to a settlement. Not with me, with Daniel. They refunded the purchase price, covered his loan fees, paid the costs he'd already sunk into planning the build, even compensated him for the months of time and opportunity he'd lost. The land was returned to me, legally, officially, permanently. You'd think that would be the moment everything felt victorious. But the real climax came a week later when Daniel asked if he could meet one last time at the lake. We stood in almost the same spot as before, this time without survey tape or construction stakes. I spent months imagining a house here, he said, staring out at the water, where the windows would face, where my kids would learn to swim. His voice cracked just slightly. Then he laughed. Guess I got ahead of myself. I hesitated, then said the words I hadn't planned to say until that moment. You don't have to let go of a dream. He looked at me, confused. I pointed down the shoreline. There's another parcel. Smaller. Not as perfect, but it's mine too. His eyes widened. You're serious. My dad bought it as a backup years ago, I said. We never did anything with it. It's not lakefront, but it has lake access, and it deserves a house on it. For a second, he just stared at me like he didn't trust what he was hearing. After everything, why would you do that? He asked. I looked out across the water, the place that started this entire storm. Because this whole mess started with people treating land like paperwork, I said. I don't want it to end that way. The final twist came later that month, when I went back to the shoebox one last time to file everything away. Tucked beneath the old HOA letters was an envelope I'd never noticed before. Inside was a handwritten note from my dad. Just one sentence. Always take care of the neighbors. The land will take care of itself. I sat there holding the note, staring at the lake through the window, realizing the ending had been waiting in that shoebox all along. The lake feels different now. Not because the water changed, or the shoreline moved, or the trees grew taller overnight. It feels different because the tension is gone. The quiet here isn't heavy anymore. It's the kind of quiet my dad used to love, the kind that makes you slow down without realizing it. For months, every visit to the property felt like stepping into a courtroom. Phone calls, paperwork, lawyers, county records, HOA meetings. Words like foreclosure, lien, and annexation echoed louder than the sound of the water. Even after the legal fight ended and the land was officially back in my name, it took time for my brain to stop waiting for the next problem. For a while, I kept expecting another letter, another email, another surprise buried in paperwork. But none came. The HOA board changed leadership not long after the settlement. New faces, new policies, a public statement about improving transparency and communication. Whether it came from genuine reflection or expensive legal lessons, I honestly don't know. Maybe both. Either way, the machine that once felt unstoppable suddenly seemed human, fallible, capable of learning. Daniel closed on the smaller parcel 2 months later. Watching the construction begin there felt completely different from that first day I saw him measure my shoreline. This time, I knew exactly what was being built and where. No uncertainty, no hidden paperwork. Just a guy building the lake access home he'd dreamed about for years. Sometimes we joke about how strange it is that we met because of a property dispute. Now we compare grill recipes and complain about the same potholes on the dirt road. Life has a strange way of turning conflict into connection when people decide not to treat each other like enemies. The shoebox still sits in my closet, but it looks different now too. Not like a pile of old problems waiting to resurface. More like a time capsule, proof that small decisions can echo for years, for better or worse. If I'd updated that mailing address sooner, none of this might have happened. If the HOA had paused the foreclosure when they saw the boundary concern, none of this would have happened. If Daniel had skipped one step during the buying process, he might have lost everything. So many tiny moments, tiny decisions, tiny assumptions, and somehow they all collided at the same shoreline. People love simple stories, clear heroes, clear villains, but real life rarely works that way. This wasn't a story about an evil HOA stealing land or a buyer trying to take what wasn't his. It was a story about systems moving forward without slowing down to ask better questions, and the people who get caught in the middle when they do. The land is still here. The sunsets still turn the lake gold. Kids still skip rocks across the water. The future we almost lost never actually disappeared. It just took a longer road to arrive. Every now and then, I unfold my dad's note again. Always take care of the neighbors. The land will take care of itself. I didn't understand how powerful that sentence was until this whole ordeal forced me to live it. Because in the end, the solution didn't come from winning a fight. It came from refusing to turn a mistake into a war. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Check your paperwork, ask questions early, and never assume the system knows your story better than you do. Small details matter. Communication matters. And the way we treat each other when things go wrong matters most of all. If this story made you think or reminded you to double-check something important in your own life, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know whose future headache you might save. Because sometimes the biggest battles start with the smallest piece of mail.